Episode number 281 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Catherine Clinton. Dr. Catherine, a licensed naturopathic physician, has spent over 16 years helping people overcome their health issues. Diagnosed with 2 autoimmune conditions and Lyme disease while in medical school, she began the long and difficult journey of healing, a path that led to the commitment to help others to not only heal physically, but to return to the relationship we evolved over millennia for a deeper sense of health and belonging. By healing herself and patients like her, she discovered that true health comes from our relationships. Dr. Catherine has learned how our quantum biological system is intimately and inseparably connected to the world around us. Our relationship with the dirt beneath our feet, the sun, the wind, the water, the plants, the season, and each other, that is real medicine. Her mission is to empower as many people as she can with this knowledge to encourage the paradigm shift we so desperately need. I have found Dr. Catherine's work on Instagram. I discovered her work and have been following her and knew instantaneously that I had to bring her on the podcast. So I cannot wait to have this conversation today. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. I'm Michelle, a fertility acupuncturist here to provide you with resources on how to create a wholesome approach to your fertility journey. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Clinton.
Thank you so much for having me. I know we've been trying to get together to do this for a while, and I'm just really excited to talk with you today.
I am so excited. I've been actually looking forward to this call for like a while, just because I found you on Instagram and I was like, oh my God, this lady gets it. Like, your work is so fascinating to me. I'm really into quantum physics in general. And then I'm like, quantum biology, like the whole idea. And just there's so many things that we're uncovering. It's kind of like the future of medicine. But also, I feel like you're very intuitive in your work. Like, I feel like you're sort of channeling a lot of really fascinating intelligence through your work. So, yeah, so that was my initial thing when I started looking at your work and like the things that you're posting and sharing. And I would love it if you can share your background and how you got into this field and also how you got into it in the way that you're getting into it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it definitely feels like I've been talking about this for years, and now the energy around it is just like so much momentum, right? It kind of used to feel like I was talking in an empty room, sort of talking to myself, right? And what happened was I was in naturopathic medical school. I was in my second year, and it was that initiation year where they really want to weed people out, right? So it's like get there at 7 a.m. If you're a couple minutes late, you can't sign the attendance sheet. You have to wait another year to take the class, that kind of like med school initiation, really long clinic hours. And it was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and Hashimoto thyroiditis, 2 autoimmune conditions. And I was diagnosed with Lyme disease. I just was like spiraling with my health. And that's when, I was in a great place to put my physical body back together, put the pieces back together. I was in naturopathic medical school. I was across the river from an acupuncture school. I was just down the hill from a very progressive allopathic teaching hospital. And so I had so many tools to work with. But for anybody who's had a chronic illness, getting back to that, productive member of society state, while wonderful to go from debilitated to being able to participate again is absolutely incredible, it still is missing a huge piece of health and vitality. And I was really struggling even after I put the physical pieces back together, so to speak. And that's when my physician, and also the one I was doing clinical rotations underneath, said you should really look at psychoneuroimmunology. And that's just a big word for how our thoughts and emotions impact our health and our biological function. And at the time, I was researching mitochondrial health because I was like, oh, this is the latest, greatest, newest thing. This was almost 20 years ago. And I read an article by Martin Picard about how our mitochondria are impacted by our emotions and our state of our thoughts, our internal dialogue. And I was like, oh my goodness, this just kind of blew me out of the water and opened up the doors to quantum biology. And then I started actually reading. I discovered the early quantum biology research from Greg Engel and Graham Fleming about quantum coherence and quantum superposition. And I was just absolutely hooked because in medical school, I was taught, like it's still being taught, we're all taught this way, that there's a chemical mechanical reason for illness and for health, right? It's all chemicals floating around, mechanical parts of our body, that key and receptor lock where the key bumps around and randomly finds its receptor, unlocks the receptor, and action can happen. And we now know that, we're trillions and trillions of cells. And for the amount of action that happens in a cell, researchers estimate it at, hundreds of thousands of tasks each second. Some researchers even say over 1 million tasks, right? And for that to be random, for that to rely on this bumping around and hoping to find that receptor is just mathematically not feasible, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that's where quantum biology comes in. It gives us this understanding of this subatomic action happening in living systems that give rise to that chemical mechanical model, which of course that exists, but this idea that it's random, that it's chance, it is just really far from what quantum biology is showing us. It's showing us that there's this intelligence, there's this language happening at the subatomic level. And it seems to be guiding what we see with our eyes, what we see with our symptoms in a doctor's office, on our lab results, right? Our blood work. And so it's such an incredible perspective change than what I learned in school.
Oh my God, it's a perspective change for life. Like for what we learn in life. I mean, there's so many things so many things that came to mind as you were talking about. Like one of them, I don't remember where I saw this, but it was something about how, like when you first start learning about science, then you start to become like almost like an atheist. You don't believe in God. But the more you
Mhm.
uncover science, it actually brings you back to God. It proves God exists, and you could say God, intelligence, whatever you want to call it. But it's basically this intelligence that runs the show of our cells and tells it where to go and what to do. And there's just so many fascinating things. I mean, I think the biggest mystery is like, how do stem cells become what they end up being? How do they differentiate when they all have the same? So the whole idea was like, oh, DNA, well, they all have the same DNA. What is it about the DNA and the blueprint that changes the way it expresses?
Yeah,
And that
absolutely.
environment aspect of it, but it's fascinating.
It is. It's so fascinating. And I've been sort of obsessed for the last couple of years about the fields, right? The electromagnetic fields and how our cells communicate with electromagnetic frequency, right? Just like a language. And we're able, like tuning forks, to kind of tune into that. And just like a tuning fork, if you strike a tuning fork that is set at a certain frequency and you have another one that's set at the same frequency, it will pick up that tone and it will start singing that same note, right? It's this communication of resonance and frequency between those two tuning forks. Or if you go into like a piano shop and you press one key, like the C key on one piano, all the C keys on all the other pianos will start to ring in
Oh my
harmony
God, I
with that.
love that.
It's absolutely
That's amazing.
amazing. And we know that our cells are communicating with electromagnetic frequency. I mean, Michael Levine has done incredible work um, showing this electromagnetic language, right? He was doing work with, I think it was salamanders, maybe frogs. I think it was frogs. And he was trying to figure out just what you were talking about. We know how our DNA makes proteins, right? We know that, but we don't know how those proteins, how those cells become an ear or become an arm, right? That we still don't know. And he was mapping out these electromagnetic frequencies that would happen when a frog would grow a leg, right? And so then he took cells and worked with embryos, and he would put that same frequency in different parts of the body, and that body would grow that arm or grow that
Wow.
face. And he took these amazing pictures where you can see the electrical imprint of like a face or an arm. So this idea that these fields of electricity are guiding, our very anatomy is just
Mhm.
absolutely mind-blowing. And the fact that we don't acknowledge that, right? It's just like, oh yeah, that happens. We grow an arm. Yeah, we have no idea how, but we're not really interested. It always like floors me that this research isn't more well funded, because it really comes down to the fundamental nature of what it means to be alive on this planet. It's incredible.
It is, and what I find, and especially just being so intrigued by the mind for so many years, and one of the things that I found was that even if there's a false, like, concept, if your mind is so attached to it and that becomes, like, something that you really feel like you've believed in, it's like a death, a little death letting go of that, even if it's false. So people
Mhm.
really hold on to it, and that's why there's this medical dogma that happens, and people really hold on to concepts. They have a hard time letting it go. It's like letting a reality shift, and it could cause anxiety for people. Like, I found that that's like a thing.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that story I told you where the physician I was working under and who was my physician, when she was pushing me to look at my emotional reactions, I was like, "Oh, no. Don't you don't you have an herb? Don't you have another
Right.
lifestyle treatment?" Or, I did
Yeah.
not wanna go there. It's hard to change. It's hard to look at things we don't wanna look at.
Yeah.
But that's science, right? I mean, that's how we've gained insight into what it means to be human, what it means to be alive on this planet. And if you look at the history of it, it's always disregarded, right? It's always somebody saying, I think it's this, and everyone else saying, that new idea is crazy and you're
Yes,
crazy,
it's true.
and so here we are with these um, sort of isolated researchers and scientists doing their work, finding incredible discoveries about light and electricity and water and frequency. And we've yet to adopt that on a mainstream model. But I see that it's coming. I'm hopeful.
I think it's coming from the people. That's kind of
Mhm.
my thing. It's not a top down thing. Now, it's funny because a lot of what Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about is that the best kind of organism is it's a bottom up. It's the group of people, the collective. And so the collective wants it, and they're going to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's how I got into this, was looking for a way to be healthy, right? A way to live my life without these day in, day out symptoms and suffering. And so I
Yeah.
think everybody is looking for that too. And on another level, people are looking for a better explanation of life. This idea
Yes.
that it's just chaotic and it's random and it's indiscriminate and it might strike you down at any moment. It's not a safe place to live, right? That does
Mhm.
not bring me a sense of ease. And I think so many
Yeah.
of us are looking for a different explanation. I think quantum biology offers that.
Oh my God. I mean, there's so many things I love about it. And eventually I'm going to talk to you about like possible books that people can read, or maybe we should just
Mhm.
do that now. And then we'll come back to some other questions that I have. But what are books for people who don't really know what this is, but it seems intriguing and there's something about it they're like, that really sparks an interest. What books can they read, or how can they find out more about it?
Absolutely. Well, what we've just been talking about with the electricity sort of guiding life, The Body Electric is just a classic from Robert
Body.
O. Becker. And that's
Mhm.
just a wonderful read, easy to read and just mind blowing. And that I think that electrical charge is really being guided by the water within us and the water
Mhm.
lining our cells. And that has a very, profound negative charge. And that comes from it being a different structure. And so the fourth phase of water by Gerald Pollack is just another hands down. I'm always recommending that. And when it comes to quantum biology and this idea of quantum phenomenon at play in living systems and looking at how electrons and protons, uh, photons of light, phonons from sound kind of guide our biology. Life on the Edge is a wonderful introduction to the science behind this and how that sort of played out in the early 2000s and how it's starting to explain our protein function, our enzymes, how birds migrate over long distances without any landmarks or any previous knowledge, right? The first time they do it, they know exactly where to go via this quantum entanglement with the magnetic field of the earth. And so those three books are sort of a wonderful introduction
Mhm.
into what quantum biology is and how it's impacting living systems like our own bodies.
Amazing. And I remember seeing in the Kirlian photography, they look at like almost like it describes the phantom limb, where
Mhm.
there's some kind of energetic body, and they think that that might be what is causing the cells to differentiate. There's this electric energy, and I don't know if Body Electric talks about that, but it's kind of like this almost I think it's called a vital body, right? Or the vital body, or like what other terms, you know?
Yeah, like the subtle body, people call it often. Yes, this energetic blueprint, and that's exactly what the Body Electric is talking about. And these researchers are actually measuring that field and then using it to regrow limbs and fingers. And they were doing this in animal studies, of course, but we know that this happens with humans as well, right? We can regrow a fingertip or a finger if it's lost, especially under the age of 5.
Hmm.
And this work was being done with human stem cells as well.
Right.
Um, and so it's just fascinating. And to start to understand and kind of unravel that language of frequency just gives us a whole different perspective of what's happening in our body and in the world around us.
I think about this, and I knew this story about under the age of 5, you can regrow the tip of a finger. What is it about under the age of 5 that kids have that we lose after the age of 5? That's the
Yeah.
question,
Yeah.
right? Are we too invested in this material world? Is that what causes us to not have that ability anymore?
I think that for lack of better terminology, we just sort of leak electricity, right? We
Hmm.
lose electrons as we age, but especially in our modern life, right? Like when my kids were young, I could not keep clothes on them. I could not keep shoes on their feet. They were outside naked, running
Yeah,
around, absorbing
totally.
all those electrons from the earth and getting that charge from the sun. And they're just really much more vital when it comes to healing, right? Their energetic patterns are just so much different than us as adults. And I think that has to do a lot with our modern day life. Us adults usually are waking up with an alarm clock. We are
Mhm.
feeling groggy. We roll out of bed, have some coffee. We're in a house lit by artificial lights. We are living in temperatures that are artificial and separate us
Mhm.
from the seasonal temperature changes. And then we go in the car with our windows up, and then we go in the
True.
office and we work all day and we come home. We're like, I deserve to watch Netflix. I'm
Yeah.
exhausted. And then we
Yeah.
go to bed. So we've completely divorced ourselves from that relationship with the sun and the
Mhm.
seasons and the
Mhm.
weather and the wind outside and the dirt beneath our feet. All of those things that we evolved over millennia with, we're really divorced. And what I see in my practice is that kids are becoming more and more affected by this. And
Mhm.
this epidemic of disease in childhood is something that I did not see when I started practice. It was
Mhm.
something that was really unheard of 20 years ago. And now it's commonplace to see a child with chronic skin conditions, autoimmune allergies, mast cell. I mean, all of these things are just so prevalent where they weren't a couple
Yeah.
decades ago.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, also just even the toxins that we're exposed to, there's just so many things, so many aspects of it. And I go back and forth because there's some things that are so out of our control. And then sometimes I'm like, wait, is what is going on within me impacting what's out? Because that's really what this is all about. It's what the ancients have always brought us back to, the internal. And we could fix the external from the internal, from like meditating and from really connecting to that divine intelligence. And then if we all do it collectively, as we know, it can actually decrease crime rate because we've seen
Yeah,
that. I wonder if that's something that more of us should be at least considering, and to bring that connection to that divine intelligence, that intelligence that we are all connected, that really is within ourselves.
absolutely. Absolutely. I say all the time, we don't end at the barriers of our skin, right? And back to
Yes.
those electromagnetic fields, if we think about it, they sort of go out in this toroidal shape. And so that electromagnetic frequency, energy, information, we
Hmm.
emit that. And it also mingles with the fields around us, picking up information and energy and bringing that back in. So we are intimately connected with the fields around us. And they impact us, right? And you mentioned some beautiful research on this idea that we can change the state of society if we have a different state, right? So, like the research looked at a group of seasoned meditators, right? They have been doing this for years and years, and they asked them to become coherent in lack of a better term, right? They became very meditative and concentrated on a feeling of peace and love and unity. And we saw this in New York, we saw this in the Middle East, that crime rates and wartime violence were decreased. And the more people that were added to the group, the more those rates declined. And they
Mm,
looked, of course, for
amazing.
confounding things, right? Is it the heat, or is this impacting it? Is that impacting it? And they couldn't explain it. And so it's this beautiful example of what HeartMath Institute talks about all the time, about how coherence in our body, how when our brain and our heart are coherent, it impacts our biology in a whole different way, right? We're innervated in our frontal lobe. We can make calm, rational decisions that impacts our nervous system, our immune system, our hormonal system. And that coherence, when we have that, can actually impact the people around us, right? And affect their level of coherence, affect
Yes.
their nervous system. It's
Yeah.
just mind-blowing.
It is. It really is. And I remember when I first got into meditation, I used to meditate at night. That was like when I did it. And I
Mhm.
found that when I meditated at night the next day, people were acting different towards me. And I'm like, is it me? But whenever I meditate, I feel like people are nicer to me, like at work, and everything's going easy. And I'm like, I'm almost like, and then, of course, when you get more into it, you start to pick up on subtleties that you just are not typically familiar with, and one of them being you feel like you can bend time. And that's the whole saying of like, if you have time to meditate, meditate for 20 minutes. If you don't, meditate for an hour. You will bend time, like literally.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and for those that don't have that experience, I think we might all have the opposite experience, right? Where you wake up and you're tired and you don't wanna get out of bed and you stub your toe and you drop your breakfast and you you spill stuff over your work project and just that energy sorts starts to snowball. And
Yes.
it's the same thing in reverse or inverse that you're talking
Yes.
about, right? That energy feeds upon itself and the world around us feeds on that too. It's a really incredible thing to experience.
Yeah, definitely. And it's almost like we're part of this mesh. And of course, we're touching that mesh. So our energy will impact it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I remember you talking about water. So
Mhm.
almost like I forget what the term was, but it was almost like activating water, or like not there's a word for it. It's like increasing the vitality, but it's like charged water.
Yeah, well, when it comes to water, water is just such an underappreciated substance in our world, right? So we have water that we drink, and so water in a glass can become more energized. Some researchers are calling it more coherent or excited, right? But then we also have that water inside of us that I alluded to before. And our cells, our cell membranes, our fascia, our DNA, all of these things are hydrophilic. They're water loving. They're not hydrophobic and pushing the water away. Water can come right up to that surface of the cell, and when it does, the interaction between that cell membrane and the water create this structuring of water. And Gerald Pollack, I mentioned his book, The Fourth Phase of Water,
Mhm.
was the first to actually identify this under a microscope. And researchers had been theorizing about it for decades, but he was or over a century really, and he was the first one to actually identify it underneath a microscope, that it is a different phase, a different structure than water that we drink in a glass, right? And we're used to those three phases, right? That solid ice, that steam vapor, and that liquid water. That liquid water can take different forms, and this structured water in our body becomes gel-like, it becomes viscous, and it actually creates, Gerald Pollack proposes, it creates this hexagonal lattice, almost like a honeycomb, right, of hexagons, and it becomes structured in a way he describes as H3O2, and if we
Mm.
have any math-minded people out there, you recognize, well, we're missing a hydrogen, and that's exactly what happens. As that structured water builds inside of us, it kicks out a positively charged hydrogen or a proton, and it creates what researchers are calling a proton wire or a proton rich zone. And the separation of charge between the two, the structured water against our cells and tissues is negatively charged, and that proton wire is positively charged. And just like a 9-volt battery, it creates energy. And this is another
Mm.
thing that Professor Pollack found in the lab. He put an electrode in that negatively charged water and one in the positively charged water, and it was enough to light a light bulb, right? So this
Wow.
starts to explain some of that biological action in our body that we couldn't explain before, um, the ability to communicate almost instantaneously, the ability for our heart and circulation to work the way it does. It just is sort of this incredible understanding that we didn't previously have. And the idea is that this lattice, hexagonal structured water. As one sheet forms, it acts as a template for more sheets to form. And what's building that? What's creating those layers and building that structured water? Infrared energy, right? So we're
Mm.
right back to your question of why we don't heal as fast as children. Well, we're separated from the biggest source of infrared energy on our earth, right? The sun. And movement creates infrared energy. Snuggling is one of my favorite ways to
Yeah.
increase our infrared energy, right? There's many different ways, but there's this water battery inside of us via this different structure of water inside of us. And we see something kind of similar in a glass of drinking water, that there are what researchers are calling coherent domains. And those
Mm.
coherent domains can have a different charge. And when they go from coherent to incoherent, or from excited to a ground state, right? These are all different terms that the research is using. They give off energy that can be used for action, right? Can be used for communication, can draw a molecule in for an interaction. So it's not this random, chaotic world that we live in. It's this beautiful frequency language, and water has such a huge role to play in that.
Wow, it's so interesting. And there's this thing where it creates almost a vortex. I've seen those
Yeah.
like containers that supposedly they make the water more alive. Now I don't understand the science of that. So do you know anything about that? And
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people are structuring, right? So Victor Schauberger was an incredible, I think he was actually a forester who was noticing how rivers flow, and that they're
Mhm,
never just flowing straight. There's always these eddies and vortexes,
mhm,
and that's creating an energetic charge, right? So when you are vortexing or stirring or creating that circular motion, you're adding not only that infrared energy, but oxygen to the water, which can
mhm,
create that structure, right? Putting water out in the sun or in the moonlight. That's something that ancient indigenous cultures did
mm,
all the time, right? We hear
yeah.
about that in the Vedic texts, in Mayan scriptures, and it's something that holds true in this idea of structured water, right? Some people are
Mhm,
using electrical conduction. There's a company out there, Viva Water, that is doing amazing research with these coils and using the
mhm,
coils to
mm,
excite the water and create the structure in the water. And it's really new, but has been talked about for so long, and for centuries, really, when we look at some of the ancient wisdom out there. And when we look at the new research around it, we find that there is research about how it's beneficial for plant growth and agriculture. It's useful for livestock,
Oh,
and
interesting.
animals.
Amazing.
And there's also research to show that it's beneficial for humans. And so my patients, because I talk about this so much, I get so many questions, right? And my bottom line is there are so many structuring water devices out there, right? And they can get really, really expensive. So what I tell people is if we're hydrated, then we structure the water within us, right? We
Mm,
structure the water with that infrared energy, tending to our mitochondrial health, which also create infrared energy, movement, getting out in the sun, safe exposure to the sun. All of those things have the ability to charge that water battery within us. So as long as we're hydrated, as long as we're drinking clean water, maybe with a little bit of mineral content, so that good old osmosis, it can get into our cells and
mhm.
and hydrate us, then that's where I really tend to focus, when it comes to just general blanket statements. Of course, I have done other things, and dived a little deeper with different patients and people, but just generally speaking, I think we can get such incredible benefit from just being hydrated and then tending to that so-called water battery in our body.
It's fascinating. I mean, I have like a million questions. I have another so of course I think about messages in the water and
Yeah.
how water responds to vibration, and it's been measured and visually could be seen in
Yeah.
the crystals that occur from certain sounds, music, but also intentions,
Mm.
words.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. And then you think to yourself, well, we're holding all of that in our body, and how is our body responding to all these frequencies? And then I got into solfeggio frequencies, and also sound bowls, and also mantras that have been done
Yeah.
for like so many thousands of years, and they've been talking about this for a long time, and how
Yeah.
certain mantras have been shown to make a difference. So those specific seed mantras, repeated even just in our minds, compared to random words, impacts the body different. So they see that
Mm.
those seed mantras actually have a healing effect, a very calming effect, versus they used other words like crick, or things that are very like not that way, and it actually causes an adverse effect. So just to show that those specific sounds make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And sound is fascinating, right? It has such a huge effect on us. We know that it structures water. We know that it has so many different effects on us, our nervous system, our vagus nerve, our oxytocin and melatonin. And when we think about it, they're pressure waves, right? They're these pressure waves that are working through a medium and creating these collisions of molecules. And when that happens, they create light, they create infrared energy. So we kind of come full circle back to, oh my gosh, it's that language again, right? It's that language of frequency again. It's incredible.
Mhm. It really is incredible. And there was another question that I had, quantum entanglement. That's another really cool thing. So, this is something that I do. I always talk about this because, of course, even when we're separated from something that we've already entangled in, that's like the quantum physics. When we're entangled into something, which means it could be a cell in our body or something that we're connected to somehow, when we get separated from that, the connection doesn't end. So you continue having that connection and that impact or relationship where you almost communicate with that. So I believe you probably know more about this. I think that they took a cell from a liver and like moved it far away, and then saw that when they were like operating on the liver, the cell reacted. So that's like an example of quantum entanglement. So when people go and do IVF, I work with a lot of fertility. So when they do IVF, I tell them, send love to those embryos, those eggs. They are
Mhm.
responding. And whether you think it's true or not, just do it anyway because it doesn't hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That idea that our thoughts can have an energetic imprint is absolutely fascinating. And I think it's clear in the research, whether we're talking about water memory with like Luc Montagnier and this electromagnetic frequency of a cell of DNA being held in the water, being able to record it and actually send it to a lab in another country. And that
That's
frequency was
so
played
fascinating.
back. I know. And that frequency was played back in that other lab to a glass of water with nucleic acids. And those nucleic acids are right, the building block of DNA. And they coalesced and formed almost 98% identical DNA just with the playing of
Wow.
this
What is
frequency.
this? This is
Uh,
who
Luc Montagnier,
okay.
and he's just one of many what people have termed water memory research, right?
Mhm.
But this idea, I think it's pretty clear. We're not 100% clear on how that's happening, but we are clear that water can act like a mirror, right? It can be imprinted. It can hold information. And so bringing that into our everyday lives is a beautiful practice, I think, and I agree with what you say, even if it doesn't, even if we figure out that it's actually something else, what a beautiful practice that is, right? To really
Mhm.
sort of cultivate our relationship with water, with the world around us, with our thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that the reason why we don't optimize our minds and our bodies the way we could is because we just don't believe it exists. Now, with all these emerging studies and the science that's coming out, it's showing us, wow, there's just so much more to us
Mhm.
than we originally thought. It's like, oh my God, my mind is blown. Like, I love this stuff. I can nerd on this all day long. I really, really love this information. But the water memory makes me think about crystals too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, Marcel Vogel, has done amazing research with not only crystals, but water as well, right? And
Hmm.
so, um and all these things we're talking about have a liquid crystal capacity, right? And that sounds
Hmm.
so like, "Oh my gosh, what is she talking about now with her crystals," right? But this is something that we're very accustomed to, right? The reason we can talk right now and I can see your beautiful face is because of these screens, right?
Yeah.
Our smartphone, our computer, our TV screens utilize liquid crystal technology.
Hmm.
And it just means that it's a mesophase between a liquid and a solid, and it is aligned as a collective. So the molecules are aligned in the same way, in the same orientation, and when an impulse of electricity comes through, they shift in a different way, allowing different light to come in to the screen and show these images, right? The
Hmm.
same thing applies to our fascia, our DNA, this water that we're talking about that lines our cells also have a crystalline property. So it's really mind-blowing when you
It
start
really
to see all the different pieces of it.
truly, it really, truly is. And then I think about also those crystal water bottles where they have crystals inside the water so that the water can submerge into quartz or rose quartz or many different ones.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's just, I'm so grateful that researchers are continuing to research this, even though it is not funded by, the
Hmm.
powers that be, right? But
Hmm.
it's such an incredible insight into life on this planet. And so I'm just really grateful that this work continues and can't wait to see what we find next. And I agree that it seems to be this full circle return to what those ancient indigenous cultures always spoke of. So I can't wait to see more.
Oh my God, me too. I definitely second you on that. And then also, just for people listening, like if people want to really impact the body through the mind, I mean, you've really given us so many great things. How can we use our intention and like really our thought patterns to impact ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that HeartMath Institute, again, has done amazing work with heart coherence exercises and this idea of creating and feeling a feeling of gratitude or love and bringing that into our heart center and cultivating that feeling of coherence and what that feels like. And I've done this for years and years. I have their professional software to use with patients. I've used it with my family for years. And what happens is after you cultivate this practice, it becomes a feeling you can sink into, right? You don't have to go through this whole exercise and meditation. You can sink into that feeling of coherence. And it's one of my favorite things to do in an incoherent conversation or room or interaction,
Yeah.
right? Is just to like, okay, whoop, I'm going to get coherent here. I'm going to hope that it brings some coherence to our interaction even if it's just me, it's absolutely worth it. So there's lots of coherence exercises on YouTube that are a wonderful place to start. Gratitude practices, just making space for our emotions, even if they aren't gratitude, right? Allowing those emotions to come and make space for them and allow them to flow through us. All of
Hmm.
these things can really rewire that emotional regulation that we have and that those thoughts in our body, right?
Yes, definitely. I think keyword regulation. It's all about regulation. It's not about like
Mm.
stopping stress from happening. It's about adapting. So it's kind of like allowing our bodies to do their thing because they're charged with this intelligence that they know what to do ultimately when we get quiet and we use these tools. And I think that once you do find that coherence and you feel that coherence, you learn, like you said, you learn how to look for it. It just becomes very intuitive.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. It's such a beautiful practice that ripples out to so many different layers of our life. Yeah.
And I will say, I have to mention something because you had talked about like when you're in an incoherent situation and you get coherent, that works. Because I've had incoherent situations or people like from family trigger it, and I felt triggered. And I said, instead of reacting, I'm just going to meditate. I'm going to sit with my feelings. I'm going to sit with this energy. And once it did settle, which to me, settling is kind of equating to becoming more coherent, things started to really feel more at ease in my body. Interestingly enough, get on conversation again. It was like everything was resolved so easily. It was like effortless. So I was like, this stuff works. And so I started to do that. Moving on, I was like, instead of being reactive, I'm just going to be proactive and kind of sit with myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a beautiful practice that has so many different uses and our health is just one of them, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So, oh my gosh. I mean, I can literally talk to you for hours, but of course, we are bound by reality time. So, but if people are hearing this, and I'm sure like everybody's fascinated by this conversation because it's just incredible information. And you're such a wealth of knowledge, which I so appreciate and love because there's so many things out there that we don't even realize. There's so much research that we don't even know is out there. And to hear that this is actually being looked at is mind blowing. So, for people who are interested in either working with you or finding more about you, how can they find you?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Catherine Clinton everywhere. That's my website, Dr. Catherine Clinton. That's where you can find me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube for longer videos. I just love to share this information because I think it helps point us in a better trajectory than we're currently on. So that's where you can find
Yes.
me.
Oh, love it. Okay, Dr. Catherine Clinton, this was more amazing than I expected, and I was expecting it to be amazing. So, I am so thankful that we had this time to talk, and I'm so thankful for the work that you do and the information that you are getting out. And this is really amazing. So, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love the work you're doing, and it was just a pleasure talking with you today.
So that concludes today's episode. You can find all of the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to share and leave a review. Reviews mean everything to podcasters, and I really enjoy hearing from my listeners. You can also find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com or email me at info@thewholesomelotus.com. I love hearing from my listeners. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com. I thank you so much for listening in and hope that you have a beautiful day.